Episode 6. The Passion narrative begins. The Last Supper. Each of the four Gospels presents a situation in which Jesus is a living challenge to the religious authorities in Jerusalem. However, John's Gospel explicitly adds an extra layer of realpolitik. In John's narrative, the Jerusalem leaders see in Jesus' popular movement a real danger to the city, the temple, and the people. A large messianic movement will upset the Romans, they fear, and the angry Romans will come and destroy everything. That very political and plausible aspect of events will reappear in John's account of Jesus' trial before Pilate. All the Gospels agree that the authorities want to arrest Jesus, but are reluctant to antagonize the crowds of supporters. They need to get Jesus on his own, away from the crowds. And for that to happen, they need someone on the inside to lead them to him at a time and place where he will be vulnerable. All name Judas, or Judas Iscariot, as the one who goes to the authorities. According to the three synoptics, he is one of the 12 special disciples chosen for mission early in Jesus' ministry. In all the Gospels, he is initially present at the Last Supper, but leaves to alert the authorities to Jesus' movements. There are few background clues as to his motivation for abandoning Jesus in this way. People have made different suggestions. Perhaps he had lost faith in Jesus. Perhaps he had not lost faith, but wanted to force Jesus to act, to be the Messiah everyone was hoping for, to stand and fight. In Mark and Luke, he takes the initiative and goes to the Jerusalem authorities in order to hand him over, and they reward him with money. In Matthew, he comes to them, first asking them to name a price. John's Gospel again suggests a mercenary motive. He is already dishonest, regularly helping himself to money from the common kitty. John and Luke will speak of Satan entering him. Thus he becomes an agent of the enemy, the accuser. Luke gives him a grisly end, reporting in the Acts of the Apostles that his stomach burst in an act of divine vengeance. Matthew, however, offers a more human account of his end. His Judas is torn with remorse for what he has done. He gives the money back to the authorities and then hangs himself. But for all the variations in the Judas story, there is one thing that all the Gospel writers emphasize. This is a part of God's saving plan. The Son of Man must be handed over. In some sense, Jesus remains in control of his destiny and knows what is going on. Whatever Judas' motivations and however blameworthy, at a higher level of reality, through his actions, the scriptures are being fulfilled. The synoptics suggest that Jesus leaves the city each night to stay with friends at a little hamlet called Bethany. One route, accurately mapped out in John's Gospel, follows the valley of the Kedron Spring outside the city walls and passes through an olive grove, the Garden of the Olive Presses, or Gethsemane, over the Mount of Olives. 3 of the Gospels describe a powerful symbolic action at Bethany just before the Passion. A woman anoints Jesus with expensive ointment the night before his last visit into Jerusalem. Luke, of course, gives this story a very different context, much earlier in his Gospel. Mark and Matthew place the incident in the house of Simon the leper, and the woman is anonymous. John places it in the house of Mary and Martha, with their brother, the resurrected Lazarus, present. And Mary is the one who brings the ointment. John adds the vivid description of the perfume of the astonishingly expensive ointment filling the whole house. The woman wipes his feet with her hair. The disciples are shocked at the waste and the expense. It could have been sold and the money given to the poor. But Jesus welcomes the act. He reads it as a heartfelt response to who he is, a generous and priceless acknowledgement of his gracious presence among his followers. This generous action is also prophetic. It anticipates anointing his body for burial. We'll now follow Mark's Gospel as our main guide through the Passion narrative, noting where the others tell the story differently. The Passion narrative, with all its variants, may well be one of the oldest layers of continuous narrative from the Jesus story. And each early variant will be pieced together from fragments of memory, sometimes eyewitness, sometimes hearsay, that are not always consistent. But of course our authors are not just trying to tell the story simply as it happened. They're also trying to tell the story in a way that reveals its meaning. Their accounts look backwards to reveal prophetic echoes in the scriptures, but also look forward, offering insight into what this all means for the readers who place their hope in the Christ. Mark sets up the Last Supper as a Passover meal. It is the first day of unleavened bread, and the Passover lambs are being sacrificed. Jesus will eat the Passover meal in Jerusalem. There is a sense of intrigue. 2 disciples are to watch out for a man carrying a water jar, itself a rare sight, who will lead them to an anonymous hostel. They will exchange a coded message with the proprietor, referring to Jesus obliquely as the teacher. And he will take them to an upper room, arranged for a Passover meal. All this heightens the sense of genuine threat, as Jesus prepares for the first time to remain in the city after nightfall, away from the crowds. It also heightens the sense that he is in full control of events. Luke follows Mark's undercover operation, though Matthew simplifies the story and has the disciples go straight to the hostel to alert the owner to Jesus' coming. Jesus arrives at the venue with the 12 just in time for the meal. The implication seems to be that the 2 disciples who made the arrangements came separately in advance. So we, the readers, have an explanation for why Judas was unable to lead the forces of authority to Jesus during the supper. He didn't know the venue until he got there. Mark makes the threat of betrayal from within explicit. As they begin the meal, Jesus announces that one of the 12 will betray him. The disciples ask in turn, "Is it me?" Jesus repeats his warning, hinting at Psalm 41, where the singer laments betrayal by one who has shared his table. Jesus emphasizes that this is as it must be. The Son of Man must go to his destiny, but woe to the one who is responsible for betraying him. There are subtle and not so subtle variations in the other writers. Luke places the incident after they have eaten the supper. Matthew follows Mark closely, but develops the scene. He has Judas expressly ask the question, "Is it me?" To which Jesus replies, "You have said as much." John has a very different account of the Last Supper to the others, but he also has Jesus identify Judas at the meal, though only to one witness. When Jesus speaks of his betrayal, quoting Psalm 41 directly, the beloved disciple asks who it is. Jesus identifies Judas with an act of tragic symbolism, the one direct hint of a Eucharistic action in John's version of the Last Supper. He dips bread in a bowl and gives it to Judas. Satan entered into his soul, according to the writer. Jesus then instructs Judas to do what he has to do, and Judas leaves. In John, Jesus is in control of every step of his journey. But let's return to Mark, who, alongside Matthew and Luke, presents the meal as a Passover meal, rooting Jesus' action in the great act of liberation from Egypt. This is the level of narrative that begins to explain what the events all mean for the Christian reader. The reader may recall 3 key moments in the rescue narrative that unfolds on Passover night. The first element is rescue from death. The blood of the Passover lamb, daubed on the threshold of the Israelites' dwellings, will protect the Israelites when the angel of death passes by to slay the firstborn of the Egyptians. The second element is the rescue from the pursuing Egyptians and escape across the sea while their enemies are destroyed. The third is the sealing of the covenant of Sinai. The Lord has been revealed as rescuer and will now create a new people, obedient to the word he has given to Moses on the mountain. Moses takes the blood of sacrifice and sprinkles part on the altar. He then reads the book of the covenant, and as the people pledge obedience, he sprinkles the remaining blood over them. Against that narrative background, Mark describes Jesus' action of blessing and breaking bread and blessing and passing on the cup of wine. The words Jesus uses are recognizably similar to those reported a generation earlier by Paul in his letter to the Corinthians as the tradition that he had received. So we can reliably suppose that what we read in Mark reflects a memorial practice familiar to Mark's own community and followed with variations across many communities in the Christian diaspora. Once again, the gospel breaks through the fourth wall, uniting the readers and their lived experience of the Christian way with the person of Christ at this highly charged moment in his journey to the cross. The reader finds themselves at one with the disciples, who are intimately one at the table of the Messiah and Saviour. The sacred symbolic action is rooted in the past, where God's saving power was definitively revealed to God's people. But it also looks to the prophetic future, to the promise of the end-time feast on the holy mountain of God. On this mountain, says Isaiah, the Lord of hosts will prepare for all peoples a banquet of rich food, a banquet of fine wines. We'll try to do some best guessing about how Mark's Christians might have understood the memorial meal in the next podcast. What we can say for now, with reasonable assurance, is that this action was regarded as important and sacred by Christians from the earliest times. Similarly to the practice of the Passover meal itself, it provided a living representation of the saving action and presence of Jesus, the crucified and risen Lord, in the midst of the gathered community of his followers. The taught structure of Mark's Gospel allows us also to notice the subtle hints that link this intimate moment in Jerusalem the night before Jesus died with the miracle of the loaves much earlier in the Gospel. There too the bread is blessed, broken, and distributed to the people sat in rows in the wilderness. The connection adds another layer of meaning to the action. At this pivotal moment in the narrative, the reader is united with the disciples gathered around the Lord on the night before his death. But they have also recognized themselves earlier in the disciples nourished by the Lord on the road in the wilderness, a symbolic foretaste of the life-giving banquet on the holy mountain at the end of time. To the layer of meaning of saving sacrifice in the blood of the covenant, we can add the layer of meaning of food for the journey through the desert for disciples who are still on the way. There is another important phrase in Jesus' memorial words. In Matthew and Luke, his blood is poured out for many or for multitudes. That phrase, for many, takes us to a further prophetic explanation for Jesus' action rooted in the book of Isaiah, additional to the models of ritual sacrifice. We have already encountered the servant songs from the middle part of the book of Isaiah and seen how they are woven into the explanatory fabric of the Gospels. The fourth song in Isaiah 53 is especially significant. There the servant of the Lord is rejected and suffers at the hands of his enemies. He becomes an object of contempt and fear. And yet, reads Isaiah paradoxically, he was pierced through for our faults. He appears rejected by God, and yet what happens to him is happening according to God's plan. By his sufferings shall my servant justify multitudes. This was clearly a pivotal text for Jesus himself as he tried to understand his mission. For his followers, it gives meaning to his story as the Messiah who suffered and died before being vindicated by God. Matthew, who otherwise follows Mark very closely, spells out the implications of the reference to Isaiah 53 for his readers. To the "for many," he adds, "for the forgiveness of sins." The different narrative strands explaining the rescue Jesus is about to bring about are interwoven in this single scene of the Last Supper. It explains in advance the deep divine meaning of the brutal human narrative of betrayal, torture, and death that is to follow. He is the Passover lamb who rescues the people from the angel of death. He is the blood of the covenant, founding a new community, renewing the relationship between God and God's people. He is the suffering servant, promised by Isaiah, whose rejection and death mysteriously atones for the sins of the many and gains them their freedom. He is food for the journey, for his followers on their way through the desert to the banquet on the holy mountain. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus finishes his blessing of the cup, makes explicit that connection with resurrection and the end time. I will not drink the fruit of the vine again until that day when I drink the new wine in the kingdom of heaven. Luke's account is rather different. He includes the sacred memorial action. However, he reports two separate blessings of the cup at the beginning and end of the meal. He attaches the memorial words to the second cup. He also frames the meal rather differently. We'll look at that in a minute. You'll realize by now that even a tiny variation in phrasing can carry a heavy load of meaning in the Gospels. When Jesus blesses the cup in Luke, we hear the words reported by Paul in the letter to the Corinthians a generation earlier. This is the cup of the new covenant. The phrase new covenant immediately places Jesus' action not just against the scene in Exodus, where the covenant of Sinai is forged between God and God's people. It also takes us to words of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, promising renewal of the covenant around the time of exile. In God's grace, the Lord will transform human hearts to be faithful to God and God's law. Jeremiah puts it this way: "Deep within them I will plant my law, writing it on their hearts. Then I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Ezekiel offers a graphic image: "I will take out your hearts of stone and give you hearts of flesh." The practice of the way of the covenant will no longer be a matter of forced obedience. It will become an act of love. Hearts will be transformed by grace. The covenant mediated by Jesus is similarly personal and relational. Both Luke and John emphasize this from the outset in their accounts of the Last Supper. Luke begins, "I have longed to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." John says directly, he had always loved those who were his own in the world, and now he loved them to the end. The affection in the words is for the benefit of the reader as much as for the actors in the drama. Luke and John's Last Supper narratives go further than Mark and Matthew. They include dialogue and drama that reveal the meaning of this sacred act for life in the community of disciples. Those who participate in the sacred meal are called to live lives that are shaped by a gracious response to Jesus himself. That response is to be manifested in the way they treat one another. In Luke, it takes the form of a lesson. At the end of the meal, the disciples fall into a familiar quarrel about status, only to be reproved by Jesus. Whoever wants to be great must become the least. They must recognize that Jesus himself is present as a servant to his disciples. John's Gospel makes that same idea vividly present in an acted parable. During the meal, Jesus gets up and performs the humble service of washing his disciples' feet. They must learn to wash one another's feet, he tells them. A little later, he spells out a new commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. The essence of Jesus' new covenant, sealed by his blood, encoded and re-presented in this sacred meal, is to be lived out by his disciples in lives of generous and humble service.